Open this door. Open it now.
Nobody is opening anything. You will stay there until you learn sense.
You cannot do this. Tomorrow is my wedding. Kenneth is waiting for me.
Kenneth is not waiting for you. Kenneth agreed. He chose his family. He always chooses his family.
You are lying.
Are we?
Ask yourself why nobody has come looking. Ask yourself why your phone has been silent since last night. Kenneth would never do that to me.
Kenneth did. Now rest. Tomorrow will come and go, and you will survive it. Common girls always do.
The morning Adaeze disappeared. The harmattan was blowing from the north, and the whole of Umuahia smelt like dry earth and burning firewood. It was the kind of morning that made old women close their eyes and say the ancestors were near. It was the morning before her wedding. Her mother, Rebecca, was the first to notice. She had come to Adaeze's room at 5 in the morning to begin the preparations, the oils, the wrappings, the prayer spoken quietly over her daughter's head, the way her own mother had once done for her. But the room was empty. The bed was made. The bridal wrapper they had saved for 8 months to buy was folded at the foot of the bed with a neatness that looked deliberate and frightening. Her shoes were by the door. Her phone was on the table, switched off. And Adaeze was gone. She did not scream immediately. She stood in that room for a long moment, touching the wrapper, touching the pillow, trying to find an explanation that her mind could hold. Then she walked to the veranda and looked out at the grey morning road, and there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign, just the wind moving through the compound like it had somewhere urgent to be. Then she screamed. By 6 in the morning, the entire compound was awake. By 7, the neighbors had gathered. By 8, the story had already left their street and was spreading through Umuahia like water through cracked ground. Adaeze, the Eze family's daughter, the bride of Kenneth Okafo, was missing. Gone the night before her own wedding. Gone without a word. Kenneth arrived at the compound at 8:30 with his groomsmen and his uncle, and the look on his face was the look of a man performing grief he did not fully feel. He spoke to Rebecca with his cap in his hands, his voice soft and measured. He said he was as confused as everyone else. He said Adaeze had been fine when he spoke to her the previous evening. He said he could not understand it. But Rebecca watched his eyes while he spoke, and his eyes did not move the way a man's eyes move when he is afraid for someone he loves. She did not say this out loud. She had no proof. She was a woman in a compound full of people who were already whispering. By midday, the whispers had found a shape. Someone had seen Adaeze speaking to a man outside the compound 2 evenings before. Someone else said she had been receiving calls from a strange number for weeks. A cousin who had never liked her said Adaeze had always been restless, always too proud for a village girl, always looking beyond what she was giving. The story the village wanted to tell was already writing itself. She had run. She had chosen someone else. She had shamed her family and shamed her groom and fled into the night like a woman with no home training and no fear of God. And Kenneth did not correct them. He let the story grow. He stood in the compound with his cap in his hands and his soft voice and his measured grief, and he let every poisonous word land on Adaeze's name without lifting a single finger to stop it. Rebecca buried her face in her hands and wept. What nobody in Umuahia knew, what only 3 people in the world knew at that moment, was that Adaeze was not gone. She was in a room in Port Harcourt, 2 hours away, behind a locked door in a house that belonged to Mrs. Okafor's younger sister. She had been brought there the night before, taken from the back of the compound while the pre-wedding celebration was still going on, while music was playing and people were dancing, and nobody noticed a young woman being walked quietly to a waiting car by 2 women she had trusted. She had trusted them because they were family, because Mrs. Okafo had embraced her at the introduction ceremony and called her daughter, because Ngozi had sat beside her at the fitting and laughed with her about the wedding colors. She had trusted her the way a person trusts the ground beneath their feet, without thinking, without question, because what kind of person considers that the ground might open? The ground opened on the night of the 14th of December, and Adaeze fell. They had told her in the car, calmly, as the lights of Umuahia disappeared behind them. Mrs. Okafo had turned from the front seat and explained it the way a teacher explains an arithmetic problem, slowly, with patience, as if the answer were obvious. Adaeze was a lovely girl. She was not the right girl. The Okafo family had considered the matter carefully and reached a conclusion. There was another family in Abuja, a family with land and a name and connections that stretched to places the Eze family could not even dream of. Kenneth was going to marry their daughter. It had been decided 3 weeks ago. The wedding tomorrow was going to be cancelled, and Adaeze's disappearance was going to be the reason. Adaeze stared at her and said nothing for a long time. Then she asked the only question that mattered. She asked if Kenneth knew. Mrs. Okafo smiled, the smile of a woman who has already won. Kenneth knew. The room in Port Harcourt was small and clean and terrible. There was a bed, a bucket, a window too high to reach and too narrow to call for help from. Ngozi brought food twice a day and left without speaking. Mrs. Okafo came once on the second day to tell Adaeze that the wedding had been cancelled and the village had already drawn its own conclusions. She said it with no cruelty in her voice, which was worse than cruelty. She said it the way you tell someone about rain, as if it is simply rain, simply the world behaving as the world behaves, and there is nothing personal in any of it. Adaeze ate the food they brought. She slept when she could. She did not cry more than necessary because she understood, in the cold quiet of that room, that crying was a luxury she could not afford. She was not broken. She was calculating. She was watching the door, watching the window, watching Ngozi's routine, watching the small gaps between one thing and the next, where a woman with patience and fury could find her way through. On the 4th night, Ngozi forgot to fully lock the outer gate when she left. It was a small thing, a tired thing, the kind of small tiredness that undoes careful plans. Adaeze held the gate and waited 1 full hour. Then she tried the door and it was still locked. But the window in the corridor outside was not. She had noticed it days ago, how it sat loose in its frame when the evening wind came. She had spent those days measuring distances with her eyes. She had been ready. She came out of that house at 2 in the morning with nothing but the clothes on her back and the address of a church she had spotted through the car window on the way in. She walked for 40 minutes through unfamiliar streets until she found it. She knocked on the pastor's door until a light came on. She sat in that pastor's parlor and told the whole story to his wife, who wept through all of it. And by morning, she had a phone in her hands and her mother's voice breaking apart on the other end of the line. Rebecca wanted to go to the police immediately. She wanted to go to the village head. She wanted to take the story to every ear in Umuahia before the sun moved another inch across the sky. But Adaeze said no. She said it quietly and she said it once. And something in her voice made her mother go still. Not yet, Adaeze said. I will choose when. She chose 3 weeks later. In those 3 weeks, she gathered everything. The pastor's wife became a witness. A neighbor in Port Harcourt who had seen the car arrive that night became a witness. She found the driver who had taken them from Umuahia, a young man with a conscience that had been eating him since the night he drove, and he agreed to speak. She gathered names and dates and a recording that Ngozi had not known she was making during one of those food deliveries. A small device tucked beneath the edge of the mattress, because Adaeze had learnt in that first day that she was going to need more than her own word against the Okafo name. She also waited because she had heard something important. Kenneth was holding a new introduction ceremony. The family from Abuja was coming to Umuahia on a Saturday in January. The compound would be full. The whole community would gather to celebrate the man who had been so heartbroken by his runaway bride that he somehow, in 3 weeks, had found himself a new and better one. Adaeze arrived in Umuahia on that Saturday morning. She wore a plain dress. She wore no jewellery. She had not come to perform. She had come to end something, and she dressed like a woman who understood the difference between drama and truth. She walked into the community square where elders were already seated, where both families were gathered, where food had been set out and music was warming up, and she walked in with the pastor's wife beside her and the driver behind her and a phone in her hand with a recording that would in the next 10 minutes rewrite everything anyone in Umuahia thought they knew about what had happened in December. She did not shout. She did not cry. She stood in the center of that square and she spoke. The recording played. Ngozi's voice filled the air, and then Mrs. Okafor's voice, calm and terrible and completely recognizable, explaining to Adaeze in that car that Kenneth knew, that it had been decided that common girls always survive. The square went silent, with the particular silence of a community that has realized it participated in a lie. Kenneth's face did something complicated and ugly. He looked at his mother, and his mother had gone completely still, her purple George wrapper and all her dignity folding inward like something punctured. The family from Abuja stood up. Their patriarch spoke 2 short sentences, looked at Kenneth, looked at Mrs. Okafo, and then turned to his daughter and said they were leaving. They left. The food sat untouched. The music did not play. The elders called for quiet and they asked questions, and every question was answered not by Adaeze performing outrage, but by evidence delivered with a steadiness that was more devastating than any tears could have been. Mrs. Okafo was asked to speak. The Council of Elders the following week, Ngozi was brought back from Port Harcourt. Kenneth sat through it all with the face of a man watching everything he allowed happen to someone else become everything happening to him. The community's verdict was not a courtroom verdict. It was something older and in some ways heavier. It was the withdrawal of the thing communities give quietly and remove loudly: respect. The Okafo name, which had meant something in Umuahia for 2 generations, began to mean something different. People remembered at the wrong moments. Doors that had been opened became slow to answer. The business connections Kenneth had traded on his family name to build began to ask quiet questions he could not answer well. Mrs. Okafo came to Rebecca's compound in February. She came without Ngozi. She came without her purple George. She came in a plain blouse and sat on a bench in the compound and asked to speak to Adaeze. Adaeze came out and sat across from her. Mrs. Okafo spoke for several minutes. She used words like sorry and mistake, and I did not know how far it would go. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime being certain, and she wore uncertainty badly. Her hands moved too much. Her eyes could not stay in one place. Adaeze listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When the older woman finished, Adaeze was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I heard you." That was all she said. She stood, went inside, and closed the door. She had already started over. In those weeks between her return and that Saturday morning in the square, something had clarified inside her. She had enrolled in a business program in Owerri that she had been postponing for 2 years because a wedding had been coming. She had taken the money her family had saved for the wedding, and instead of mourning it, she had used half of it to begin something small and her own. She had stopped waiting for her life to be returned to her and began building a different one. Not a lesser one, not a consolation one, but one that was entirely hers, assembled piece by piece in the quiet after everything false had been stripped away. The women of Umuahia watched her, and the way they watched her changed over the months that followed. There had been a moment when they whispered about a girl who ran. Now they watched a woman who had come back. The difference between those two things lived in how she walked and how she spoke, and how she never once looked like she was asking anyone's permission to be whole. Rebecca watched her daughter and said nothing for a long time. Then one evening she called Adaeze to sit beside her, and she held her hand and said, "Your grandmother always said that what is yours cannot be taken. I used to think it was just something old women said." Adaeze looked at her mother and smiled. Not the wide, celebratory smile of a woman performing triumph, the quiet, private smile of a woman who has been through something real and come out the other side knowing exactly who she is. The harmattan came around again that December. The dry air, the burning firewood smell, the mornings that made old women close their eyes and say the ancestors were near. Adaeze sat on her veranda in Owerri. A different city, a different morning, a life that belonged entirely to herself, and she closed her eyes too. Not from sadness, from gratitude for the locked room in Port Harcourt that had shown her, in the worst possible way, the only thing she had ever truly needed to know, that she was more than enough. She had always been more than enough, and now finally she was living like she believed it. If you found out the person you loved agreed to have you taken and hidden, would you ever forgive them, or would silence be your final answer? Drop your thoughts below. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it today. And drop a comment. We want to hear from you. God bless you.